Well, good morning, everyone. You're at the Air and Space Museum with beautiful Discovery out there. How better? Well, I can't think of a better way to start the day. So, as an old shuttle main engine person, and I mean old. First of all, I'm Dan Dumbacher, the CEO for AIAA. We really want to thank you for taking the time to come and participate in this important summit. We are so pleased to welcome you to the Udvar Hazy Center for the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. It is a very appropriate place to have this kind of a discussion. Between 1969 and 1972, there were 6 Apollo moon landings. One could argue that the Apollo 11 landing site is one of the most significant historic locations for all of mankind. In 2024, on the 55th anniversary of the Apollo 11 mission, this summit is addressing how we should protect these sites, these Apollo sites, as well as other aspects of our off-Earth space heritage. Returning to the previous historic sites, space heritage sites, is not new. The second lunar landing, Apollo 12, with my good friend Pete Conrad, landed less than 600 feet from the Surveyor 3 robotic lander. The Apollo 12 astronauts brought the Surveyor 3 television camera and several other pieces back to Earth for examination, and many of these pieces are now in the Smithsonian's collection, including the television camera, which is on display downtown at the Air and Space Museum. The United Nations Outer Space Treaty states that a country that sends objects into space, onto the moon, or other celestial bodies does not lose jurisdiction or ownership of those objects. In 2020, the United States passed the One Small Step to Protect Human Heritage in Space Act to preserve the Apollo moon landing sites from disruption by any nation or private company working with NASA on the lunar surface. But the Outer Space Treaty and this act leave several questions unanswered. NASA, in coordination with the U.S. Department of State, created the Artemis Accords, giving us a framework to build international partnerships in achieving a sustainable and robust presence at the moon, and prepares us for the first human missions to Mars. We've just reached 42 signatory countries, all agreeing that we need to establish and abide by norms of behavior for how we explore space sustainability and how we use these space resources. Dozens of human and robotic missions have already left their mark on the lunar surface beyond the 6 Apollo landing sites. That number just increased this past week when China landed a robotic probe on the far side of the moon and is now returning samples. With lunar exploration activity increasing, we must ask how best to preserve our outer space heritage for future generations, and today's inaugural summit will discuss this issue and more. Our keynote speaker, along with our distinguished panelists today, will provide us with a multidisciplinary view of this emerging and complex issue. You have been invited to this summit to add your valuable perspectives in today's conversations. We are delighted that the outcomes from today's summit will be shared with the aerospace community later this year during AIAA's Ascend event in Las Vegas. We are also working with the Smithsonian to share the recordings of the summit with a wider audience. Let me now introduce Teasel Muir-Harmony, curator of the Apollo collection at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. Thank you, Teasel, and the entire Smithsonian team for being a wonderful host for today's event and at this impressive facility, and we look forward to a great day. Teasel?
Thank you, Dan. It's been such a pleasure co-hosting this event with the AIAA already, and I'm sure it will continue to be throughout the day. Thank you for coming. We're so pleased to have you here. It should be a wonderful day with wonderful conversations and hopefully lots of insights about what we do with outer space heritage. So I have the honor of introducing our opening keynote speaker, Dr. Thomas Jones. Dr. Jones is a veteran NASA astronaut, a scientist, an author of 7 books, and a pilot. In more than 11 years with NASA, he flew on 4 space shuttle missions to Earth orbit. In 2001, Dr. Jones led 3 spacewalks to install the centerpiece of the International Space Station, the American Destiny Laboratory. He has spent 53 days working and living in space. A distinguished graduate of the Air Force Academy, Dr. Jones piloted a B-52D strategic bomber and earned a doctorate in planetary sciences from the University of Arizona. He studied asteroids and robotic exploration missions for NASA and engineered intelligence gathering systems for the CIA. Dr. Jones.
Oops. Gravity, it's a nasty thing. Good morning. I'm Tom. Good to be among friends today in just a marvelous place. So it couldn't be a better venue for our topic of today. I'm so glad to be with you this morning. Thanks for the generous introduction from Teasel. And it's neat that we're all here with excitement and a passion for space history. And it's great for me to be among you. It's the 55th anniversary of the Apollo 11 landing, and so it's a good time, a timely venue, timely location, timely calendar date to start this conversation and move it forward. So it's just my job to give you a few opening thoughts from one person's perspective on preserving the space history. And I grew up with the space age and lived through most of the history that you guys are trying to preserve, that we're all trying to preserve. And I'd like to share a few thoughts about what I think about this endeavor of yours, a very worthy one. So 55 years on since Apollo 11 and Neil and Buzz and Mike going up there to put humanity's first steps on another world. And now it's our job to follow up on their success and their commitment to preserve the physical traces of those world-changing accomplishments. I think when we look down through history, if any of us could peek forward in time 1,000 years hence, this late 20th century accomplishment by the human species would be one of the landmarks in the last millennium of human achievement. So there's the Apollo 11 landing site. You've all seen pictures like this before. There's a lot of artifacts up there. What can we do to work collectively and around the globe to make sure that these are available for study and enjoyment and reflection by future generations of humans? And what better place to start off this conversation than the National Air and Space Museum? You know, there's the centerpiece of the collection, the jewel here, Discovery, the space shuttle, very close to my own history and career. And it's just an inspiration to me. And this museum has been an inspiration to me throughout my entire life. The space artifacts, the Apollo stories that I learned as a kid growing up in this area, and then seeing them presented in a new way now with the new museum on the Mall is really an inspiration. I grew up just up the road in Baltimore, Maryland, and I was in the east side of the suburbs of Baltimore in a town called Middle River, and the Martin Marietta Company in the 1960s during the space race was building these Titan II missiles to carry the Gemini astronauts into space. And so as a 10-year-old Cub Scout, I went to the factory and saw the checkout of the Gemini launch vehicles and looking up at these 10-story tall missiles with the Gemini capsule soon to ride on top. I thought, what a cool job these space flyers have. And in fact, I didn't know it at the time, but all the Mercury and Gemini astronauts were coming into town to view their launch vehicles and be with them through the checkout process. So they put us on the path to the moon that the Apollo astronauts fulfilled just a few years later. And this is the spark that got me going. And then so by the time the Air and Space Museum opened in the mid-'70s, I was able to stand behind a cutout of Buzz Aldrin there and say, that's my future aspiration. So that was really a treat. And that cutout was at the National Air and Space Museum even before the new museum opened on the Mall in 1976. So I wanted to join those explorers. And that was the path that the museum and the accomplishments of Apollo set me on for the rest of my career. So my career, of course, is tied up with the space shuttle. And, of course, Discovery, I could throw the remote control out there and bump it off the top of the fuselage there. It was a privilege as an American to represent our country in space and fly on 4 space shuttle missions. And I have just been wrapping up, and now I'm marketing a 3-year project called Space Shuttle Stories, in which I try to capture the human element of the space shuttle's history. 30 years of flight history in the space shuttle program, and it stretched in development from the 70s all the way to the 2010s. So what I recognized for my little role in this preservation effort was to try to capture the stories from the astronauts. And there were 135 shuttle missions, and my job over about 3 years plus was to interview 130 plus astronauts, one from every one of the shuttle flights, all 135. There were 355 individuals who flew on the shuttle, but I could never interview 355 people. I don't have the patience for that. But I do have just barely the patience to get on Zoom calls with 130 plus of my colleagues. And so I tried to capture one story from every one of the missions and set them down, condense them, and now they're out in this beautiful book from Smithsonian Books. And it's these astronaut memories are a volatile sort of artifact, if you will. As time proceeds, we've been losing some of the shuttle astronauts, just as we've lost most of the Apollo explorers. And so just in the time since I finished the interviews on this book, we've lost 4 astronauts who've flown west. And a couple of them have been increasingly frail, and we can't talk to them anymore. So it was a chance to grab this history before it evaporated. And of course, that's what our endeavor here is all about today, trying to preserve these artifacts of history before they're lost to us. My stories were formed on the space shuttle on 4 flights, 3 science flights, 1 trip to the International Space Station. There I am in my spacesuit on the space station. You may not know this, but I know Robert Perlman knows this, but NASA astronauts, when they climbed aboard the space shuttle, everything they wore, everything they were going to use was provided by NASA and the government. So from the skin outward, all of the stuff was government provided. And only in rare cases did they allow you to keep any of that gear or make it personally yours. So, for example, my spacesuit that I wore outside on the space station, there it is trussed up at the end of my EVAs. I had to leave it at the space station for the next crew that was coming on board. So I don't have anything of my spacesuit except the patches and emblems on the outside. They're Velcroed on. They tore those off, and I brought those home, and now they're on a plaque on my wall at home. So I got to keep the emblems on there. And you know, even the items that you used inside the cabin, none of that stuff was yours. From suit up at the crew quarters at Kennedy Space Center through launch and then landing, all of that equipment had to be given back. It was inventoried, and then they had a checklist when you got off the shuttle, and you had to give everything back, except a couple of things. So my class ring, my wristwatch, these flew on the shuttle with me, so I got to keep those. Your personal watch you could keep that you brought on board and took off again. They gave you a little Coke can-sized pouch, and if you could fit 20 items in there, you could carry 20 personal souvenirs to space and back. So, you know, things that you would fly for your mom or your uncle or your aunt or your grandparents, you could fly in that little pouch, and that was given back to you at the end. Even your underwear was laundered and put back in bonded storage for the next time that you flew. You didn't get to carry your underwear home with you. So at the end of the shuttle program, you know, all of this stuff was offered up to the Smithsonian and to educational institutions around the world. I hope my underwear didn't go that way. But it was all offered for auction and for distribution for educational purposes. And then anything that was excessed was auctioned off, including some of the in-cabin gear that you might see here. And you know, the shuttle program ended with the shuttle's retirement in 2011, and I'm still trying to track down my underwear. Where could it possibly have gone? They should have given that back to me at the very least. I did have one nice item that I was able to bring. If there was enough storage space on board, the crew could take up some educational items with them to use in broadcast. So I had some TV props. I had a baseball cap from the Baltimore Orioles. You know, I had my high school T-shirt. And if I could use those in an educational way on broadcasts to the ground or recordings, I could take those up and then bring them back with me at the end. So I had my copy of 2001: A Space Odyssey by Arthur Clarke. It was our flight was the first shuttle flight, the first human space flight of the new millennium in 2001. So I brought my copy of the novel and was able to break it out in flight. Marcia Ivins, my crewmate, had never read that book. And so we had a spare day in orbit because of bad weather back on the ground. She got to read some of 2001 while she was in space. And then she said to me, "Do you think they could have really done that?" And, you know, so argue with Arthur Clarke. So that book made its way finally to the Air and Space Museum, and it's in the collection here as a representative of that space station flight. So that's the shuttle blasting off at Kennedy Space Center. A lot of the shuttle is preserved here with Discovery and her sister orbiters around the country. A lot of the hardware was distributed, as I said, to museums and educational institutions. And, you know, I'm able to stand here in front of the orbiter and use it as an educational tool. And it's a great touchstone for me for my career. But down at the Kennedy Space Center, for example, a lot of the shuttle heritage has gone away. It's been repurposed or retired. So the launch service structure there on the shuttle launch pads, which were once the Apollo launch pads, were demolished to make way for the next generation of spaceflight. There's pad 39A, where Neil and Buzz and Mike left Earth from, and then I flew 3 shuttle missions from that pad. It's now leased to SpaceX, and that's the SpaceX launch structure up on the top. So all that Apollo and shuttle heritage is gone. It's been demolished. I had to fight to get one piece of steel from the pad structure that I could preserve as a personal memento. Millions of pounds of it, and I had to really go through a lot of hoops to get to it. I don't think I could recreate it today. Don't come up and ask me about that. There's pad 39B. I flew once from that pad, and that's where Apollo 10 lifted off. And now it's been stripped clean for the Artemis program. So the infrastructure of Apollo and shuttle has largely disappeared in a physical way there. The firing rooms have been repurposed at the Launch Control Center, and some of those consoles have been saved, but not all by any means. The shuttle main engines that propelled my crewmates and I to orbit, they're being expended. They were once reusable, now they're going to be flown on Artemis as boost engines for the core stage of the Artemis Space Launch System vehicles, and they'll be winding up at the bottom of the ocean floor. So a lot of that main engine hardware, fortunately there's a main engine here at the museum. And then even the tanks and boosters of the shuttle program, there's only one external flight-worthy tank, and that's it there at the California Science Center. And a set of spare boosters are now being lined up with the tank and the orbiter Endeavour, and they'll be displayed in the launch configuration at that museum in Los Angeles. So they preserved one example of the launch stack, if you will, but all the rest has been gone or will be expended in the years to come. So been tough to preserve some elements of the shuttle hardware and its 30-year history. What about the Apollo hardware 55 years on? There's still hardware left by the astronauts on the moon. There's the descent stage of the Eagle. The scientific experiments are visible along with a camera, and we know where the flag was knocked over there on Apollo 11. Just last weekend, I was at the Kennedy Space Center walking through the remnants of the Apollo heritage down there and reveling in the chance to walk under a Saturn V. There were 3 Saturn Vs left over that should have been flown but weren't, so we can see them today. And they're here on Earth for us to explore. Those mammoth vehicles are just awe-inspiring. There's the Kitty Hawk Apollo 14 command module. Out of that entire stack, of course, of the Saturn V, only the command module at the tip survived to bring the astronauts home. And so that's all that's left of a typical Saturn V launch, the crew and their precious lunar samples that they brought back. The lunar modules that we can see today were all unflown, some of them flight articles like LEM 9 here and LEM 2 at Air and Space, but they were never flown in space. And the interior of the lunar module, it's just a simulator. That's all we have left on Earth. The flight vehicles expended in these missions to the moon. There's a footnote to that story as well. And specifically on Apollo 11, we have Columbia here at the National Air and Space Museum down there at the mall. That's the only artifact from that mission that remains. A couple of asterisks or footnotes, of course. There are remnants of the main F1 engines from the first stage that have been recovered by Paul Allen's firm, retrieved off the ocean floor. So we can see a couple of touchstones or relics of Apollo 11 here on Earth. The rest of it's up there. So how are we going to preserve that for study, access, and education in the future? That's the LEM Eagle on the surface of the moon. The scientific instruments that Buzz and Neil placed up there, they're still available to look at and, image. I hope that we don't actually go over there and touch them again, because I think that would ruin the site itself. And the ascent stage of Eagle here in this dramatic photo was lost after the crew returned to Earth. But I just read, just in researching this talk, that in 2021 there was an analysis, maybe some of you know about it, that says it's possible dynamically that Eagle is still in lunar orbit. No one really knows whether it's there now. We'd have to do a radar search, but wouldn't that be a prize for the Smithsonian to someday get, with some engineering help, the lunar module Eagle back to Earth? And then, of course, we can go through all the Apollo missions, the other 5 landings that took place. This is Apollo 17 with Gene Cernan. on the surface of the moon. And all of that hardware, in this case, covers tens of square kilometers that they traversed across the moon, starting from the Challenger in the valley of Taurus-Littrow. There's Jack Schmitt, who's scooping up some lunar samples as one of the only geologists who went to the moon. I did talk to Jack in preparation for this meeting, and I said, what would you think about retrieving artifacts from the Apollo 17 site? Would you want to bring anything back personally that was significant to you or significant to telling the story? And he said that the real-time photography, the lunar reconnaissance orbiter images of the landing site, and future higher resolution images should be enough for history. I can't think of any aging data, studying the artifacts and how they've aged with exposure to vacuum and the sun. I can't think of any aging data that we absolutely have to scientifically justify retrieving them. He says, in my current synthesis work on the Taurus-Littrow geology, there are some samples that I wish I had obtained, but we did pretty well. And of course, part of that collection of about 850 pounds of moon rocks. So he says, no, just the honor of flying Challenger with Gene Cernan and getting home was personal enough reward. So it's Gene in the right window, and Jack is just out of sight there on the left, in the left window of the lunar module. And there's the evidence of what they brought back along with the other Apollo crews. So we have those samples to access and use as educational tools and historical touchstones of their visits to our neighbor in space. But now we've got our own space challenges going on. As Dan referred to at the beginning, Chang'e 6 just landed and then blasted off again with lunar samples. And it's just an example of the vastly increasing access to the moon that we're starting to see. First, access to low Earth orbit's been expanding exponentially, with lower launch costs, increasing frequency of launches to low Earth orbit, and now we're seeing a number of nations, China, India, Japan, and of course the US, going back to the moon, and there will be others as well. And as we know, every time you land something on the moon, the exhaust plume from the rocket sprays out at rocket exhaust velocity dust particles in every direction. And those can go into orbit around the moon, blasted off from the lunar surface. And we know from our examination of the Surveyor camera and artifacts brought back on Apollo 12 that a lot of the surfaces of Surveyor 3 were pitted and sandblasted by the descent from the lunar module Intrepid. And so we have to anticipate that if anybody goes to land near one of our historic sites on the moon, then it's going to be damaged by the blast of the lunar landing engines. And so that really sobers us up quickly in thinking about how to preserve these sites. In fact, with 50 years of access to the moon in the future, I would guess that there's going to be enough debris sprayed around that you'll start to fill in some measurable way, the footprints of the Apollo astronauts on the moon because of the global dust deposits that will be kicked up. So it's going to happen. What can we do to mitigate the effects of moving back to the moon and then beyond? And there's the Surveyor artifact that we talked about, the TV camera from Surveyor 3. Now, there's some possibility that there's other Apollo hardware out there, maybe the lunar module ascent stage. This is the S4B, the third stage of the Saturn V in solar orbit. Well, this one was probably crashed into the moon on Apollo 17. Does somebody know? I think it struck the moon to kick off the seismic vibrations there. But there are some S4Bs from Apollo that are still in solar orbit or in Earth-accessible orbits. So if you know a billionaire with a large spaceship that has a cargo bay that opens up, maybe we can talk to that person and retrieve some of this remaining Apollo hardware for eventual return to Earth. In the meantime, it should be left in its caretaker orbits for the foreseeable future until we can figure out a way to not damage it in getting it back, or study it in situ. And there's 1 million tons of hardware in low Earth orbit, speaking from my own personal interest, that's scheduled for demolition in 2030. I would hate to see that happen. Really bad optics to dump the International Space Station into the Pacific Ocean. So my hope is that we spend the same amount of money on a deorbit rocket and spend it on a boost rocket that puts it into a caretaker orbit 2,000 kilometers above the Earth where it will be for centuries, where we can study it, access it, inspect it, and then eventually preserve and salvage parts of it. So that should be part of our discussions outside the Apollo arena, but certainly as part of preserving space heritage. So what are we going to do in the future? You know, we've got all these challenges about increasing access to the moon. What can we do to preserve the precious artifacts of lunar exploration's first generation? I don't support retrieving those artifacts in any way. I think that they're best left in situ. Just the mere act of going to those sites is going to trash the environment and the setting there. So maybe a high-speed, low-altitude digital orbiter could come by along the way of a lunar reconnaissance orbiter and document these sites in such a way that we can recreate them virtually on the ground here for people to study or walk through with VR goggles or the technology of the future. So maybe that's the best way to document these sites. If we do actually provide tourist access to any of the Apollo or historic landing sites on the moon, then we should be standing back, putting viewing towers up with high-resolution cameras that can give us the view into the site but preserve it from destruction. And eventually, I think it would be a good idea. One of my friends mentioned the possibility of, in the low lunar gravity, finally erecting domes over some of the most significant sites. Maybe we can do that in the century to come to protect them and preserve them for future visitors. So we don't want to wind up in a situation where a couple of centuries hence we have no idea of the physical presence of, for example, the Lewis and Clark expedition. William Clark's carving into Pompey's Pillar in Montana is the only physical trace that I can think of where we see the passage of the core of discovery. We don't want to be in that situation 500 years from now where there's no trace of where Neil and Buzz first walked the moon and where Gene and Jack left the moon for the last visit from Apollo. You know, today, it's been 500 years since Columbus's arrival in the New World. We don't know where he landed. There's a lot of historical debate about that, but no one knows where the first steps from the Europeans took place in the Bahamas. So we don't want to wind up in this situation where our history has completely vanished. I'm a history buff of all stripes, and right in my neighborhood here in Northern Virginia, this is an aerial shot of the Ox Hill battlefield from the Civil War 160 years ago. And that little park is 4.8 acres, only about 1.5% of the battlefield itself. The rest is all developed, townhouses, parking lots, streets. And so in many cases from our own Civil War history, the history's been demolished by the pressures of development. And we can imagine with the resource-driven activities on the moon to come, that we could wind up very easily where all of our lunar, our first-generation lunar visits are wiped out by the pressures of resource development on the moon. That's something that we should strive mightily with international conversations to avoid. And I think we'll get some good reactions to preserve everybody's first sites on the moon. So let's have a great day discussing the possibilities of how we can save the evidence of the presence of the Apollo astronauts and how we can recognize the achievements of all of the nations and visitors to the moon, but making sure that 500 years from now we all have access to the first traces of humanity's steps out of our earthly cradle. Thank you very much. I have some time for questions if Teasel would like to kick that off.
I'll leave you to the podium and hopefully I can get this working. So we can open up to audience questions. I have a handful of questions as well, but if you have a question you'd like to ask, just raise your hand.
What kind of resources would be required to get the access to the orbit?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to how many pounds of thrust or how much propellant it will take to get us up to a safe orbit, but I think if you're, the ISS is at about 240 miles up right now. So if you took it to 500, it would be up there for centuries. So, and a little bit farther for some margin and to keep it out of any constellations that are currently in use, that would be very good. And so I just don't want to see the entire structure just dumped into the Pacific without the chance to think about it more soberly instead of having the pressures of getting it out of the NASA budget so they don't have to pay for its operations. And I'm not proposing that we operate it. I think it should just be put into a graveyard or storage orbit until we can actually find a way to salvage it. There may be some pieces that can actually be feedstock and be recycled for future construction efforts in space. But let's save some of the significant portions of the ISS for posterity. And parked up there, it's not going to do anybody any harm, and it'll be up there to give us lots of time to salvage it. There was one effort, a study effort back before COVID, that looked at propelling the ISS into a lunar Lagrange point for storage. And so there's been some calculations at NASA about how much rocket thrust that would take. It's probably best done with a solar-powered ion engine that you could hook up to the solar arrays on the ISS and provide it with a couple of tons of xenon and boost the thing up there at a very slow spiral out to the storage orbit.
So I have a couple questions. Thank you so much for being here. The first one is, given that you did ask Jack about what would be preserved from the Apollo 17 mission, and obviously his more lackadaisical answer about some of that historical value, there's clear that there's kind of this tension between a scientific presence and one of a social science presence or a historical presence. Do you think that the opinions of astronauts should be prioritized when thinking about what may be good to be preserved in some of this, or those who do have that larger role? And then the other question that I would have regarding this kind of reuse and revitalization of some of the things even at Kennedy is, do you still see historical value in things that have been continued to be repurposed? I just heard from talking to someone earlier about environmental chambers that continued to be used after Apollo. I mean, are we in a Theseus's ship kind of situation at that point?
Well, for the second question, I think it's great that we did repurpose a lot of the Apollo infrastructure down there for shuttle and made use of it for the 30 years of the shuttle program. But a lot of it was lost. So all the launch umbilical towers, those gigantic gantries that stood next to the Saturn V, almost no pieces of those remain. A couple of them are preserved down there, just a couple stories in the Apollo Saturn V Center. It's nice when, as a flyer, I would go down to the Cape and ride up the fixed service structure up to the space shuttle, to the crew cabin, and think that, hey, this is the same steel, was just rearranged for the shuttle's gantry that the Apollo gantries were made of. So I got to ride on that historic pad and think, you know, Neil and Buzz and Mike rode up the same elevator shaft. It wasn't the same hardware, but it was the same idea. So we've made good use of that. Of course, NASA has to be a good steward of the investment that was made during Apollo, and now it has been a good steward of using the remaining shuttle hardware to enable Artemis. So the crawler that hauled the Saturn V and the shuttle out to the pad has just been renovated and beefed up to carry the heavier Artemis vehicle out there. So they're doing a good job of that. And I recognize that from a corrosion control standpoint, sitting next to the ocean, you're not going to be able to preserve megastructures at Cape Canaveral because that's just not possible. The budget's not there, and nature would defeat our efforts over time anyway. So we've got to find a way to just find the most important items that we can save and then use them as instructional tools. So I'm glad that 3 Saturn V's are left over and that we can have school children look at how we got to the moon in that sense. Now, you asked about it, whether astronauts should have a priority role. No, it's just good to ask their opinions, whether they have some kind of an off-planet perspective that might inform our plans and discussions about how to preserve some of this material. And I did talk to Fred Hayes as well, and Fred was on Apollo 13, didn't leave anything on the moon. However, he said, you know, just the privilege of flying Aquarius, their lunar lander, to save their lives getting back was what he personally took with him. He didn't need a physical object for him to retain that impression and that gratitude towards that hardware. So, you know, the answer is going to vary by flyer. You know, I'm happy to have given up my underwear for the cause. But, you know, what I've got to retain, you know, my watch, my ring, that's enough for me. So I didn't need a piece of the control panel of the Discovery for me to be happy about it. So just listen to the astronauts. They might have an interesting take on how to preserve this stuff, because they're interested parties in making sure that their small contributions individually wind up being able to inform future generations and inspire people to follow in those footsteps.
Firstly, thank you so much for being here and sharing your perspective and journey with us. My question is particularly related to the heritage sites that you mentioned that we should maintain on the surface of the moon and the artifacts that remain there. Could that bring about an issue in terms of establishing safety zones on the moon and cause an issue of international hostility? I was wondering if you had any sort of perspective on that issue, especially having been to the ISS and seeing some of the international collaboration in the space domain.
Yeah, well, my ISS impressions are that the Russians that I worked with on the space station, I was only there for a week, but those were professional colleagues of mine, and it's one of the few remaining ways that Russia and the US can talk to each other on a rational, truthful, fact-based basis is our relationship at the space station. So I have hopes that that pathway can be preserved into the future, and so that we can restore a broader communication between our two nations. And as we look at the other countries that are now going to access the moon, we ought to use that same professional pathway. I belong to our professional society, which is the Association of Space Explorers, and we have international meetings every year where the astronauts from the various countries, including China, can talk to each other. And that provides, first of all, a technical link, and then a personal bond that we can use to discuss things like preserving heritage on the moon. I'm just convinced that the Chinese would love to preserve their first robotic touchdown site on the moon as we are in preserving the Apollo heritage. So what I don't want is what you referred to, where we have resource attractions to a specific zone like the South Pole and start to put our footprints on top of each other, and then have these economic disputes that would lead into then isolating or barring access to the historical sites around the moon. So we don't want to go down that pathway. So I would like to see the discussions look towards, as we access the moon for ice and other resources, maybe we should say, okay, from the first Artemis touchdown, we're going to put our resource activities kilometers away from that if we can, just to keep that site preserved. And we'll do the same for wherever the Chinese go when they get to the South Pole eventually. We'd like to just let them have their historic site and recognize it and bring up whatever artifacts they would like back eventually. And then we can do our economic activity somewhere else. It's a big moon. I think we should be able to accomplish that. And it should be part of the idea of, as the Outer Space Treaty states, we should be always ready to rescue a crew that's in distress or cooperate in saving other astronauts in Earth orbit around the moon. And so if we can frame some of our historic discussions with the same safety approach that's been in place, we can actually probably make some good progress that way. Because they're tied together, I think. It's one gesture of good faith tied to another.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. Digging into the last question maybe a little bit deeper, is it necessary to preserve in pristine condition all 6 sites, or do we decide that we need 17 maybe, since you spoke about 17, and the others can be dealt with accordingly? Because number one, it's restrictive. Number two, it becomes almost like a religious event.
Well, that's for our discussion to decide on. My own opinion is that the landing site with the descent stage and the astronaut gear surrounding it, the parked rovers and so forth, at all the sites, I think we should try to keep those as keep-out zones and just access them digitally with imagery rather than going into the sites physically. And then there should be no attempt to preserve the Taurus-Littrow Valley, for example, from ingress. Just the touchdown site itself would be sufficient, I think. But for Apollo 11, something that's the first touchdown of humanity on another world, I think you might want to have a bigger keep-out zone for that so that we just can ensure that, for example, if you're going to come down there with your tourist bus from 2001: A Space Odyssey and land near the Apollo 11 site, do it behind a ridge line so that the jet blast doesn't carry over to the landing site itself, and then trek the rest of the way in to the edge of the keep-out zone to get your tourist look at it. So I think Andy Weir's novel Artemis had some Apollo 11 park that had been set up. So, but they were trying to protect it, I believe, from destruction. So, no sacred designation, but let's try to preserve the immediate touchdown zones. That's my opinion.
Hi, Tom.
Do you have my underwear?
No,
He's
sadly.
from Collect Space, Robert Perlman.
No. But I might be able to find it for you. No, using another object as a point of discussion, NASA yesterday nixed or announced a decision to nix a commercial mission to reboost Hubble, the Hubble Space Telescope, and another astronaut colleague of yours once said that sending humans up to Hubble to service science is worth the risk to life, but going up there to bring Hubble back to Earth, per se, for putting in a museum might not be, that it's not worth the risk to life. As an astronaut, can you comment on if we wanted to preserve objects off the moon, if that is the mission, a dedicated mission, is that worth the risk to human life?
At this point, with our risk associated with rocket flight, I would say no. I think it's just too risky an affair to, especially at the lunar distance, to try to do any kind of historical retrieval. But in decades hence, it's going to be much more routine, and it'll be much safer, of course, and more economical. So I think we just store these objects and keep them safe until we can eventually decide what to do with them economically or historically. And so Hubble, again, rather than dump it into the ocean, I would get it up and store it somewhere. And then some future tractor beam will be invented to enable us to get it down. You know, I just hate to see that scientific, that revolutionary scientific capability just trashed.
Thank you. Your presentation was very interesting.
Oh, thanks.
I enjoyed it. Thank you. I have two questions for you. The first is, in your personal relationships with other astronauts, particularly those from outside the United States, have you found that they have a similar perspective about preserving cultural objects, objects that have been on the moon, objects in perhaps their personal possession, or has that perspective been different? And the second question is, with regards to the preservation of historical objects and their reuse, to what extent have you or your colleagues looked into the same question in terms of what other countries, archaeologically rich countries, have done in their own territories? For example, an archaeologically rich country like Italy, when they often find objects they've reused over historical periods. Has that been something that you have looked at?
Second question, no. I'm just a reader of archaeology books, and it's just at a popular level, I really enjoy looking into our past, but I don't have any special expertise in it. So let's go back to the space portion of your question. I apologize, I can't address the second part. But working with the Russians and our other international partners on the space station, I would say that they would be just as interested in preserving the lunar sites, for example, of Luna impacts and Luna soft landings and Lunacod. That would be something that they would be interested in preserving, just because of the engineering achievements that their countries demonstrated with those lunar landings. Yeah, so the Russians lost the moon race, and they're not going to be eager to say, hey, I want to be at the forefront of preserving the Apollo 11 site. It's just human nature. But I think that they'd be interested in preserving those historical sites on the moon that relate to the Soviet Union and then later Russia or China's events there. But the Russian perspective is different. You can look at their version of the space shuttle Buran. Their one orbit flight of Buran took place in the late 1980s, and that vehicle was stored. It wasn't viable economically for the Russians to keep flying that. So it was stored in a hangar down at Baikonur, and a snowstorm collapsed the roof, and it was destroyed by the collapse of the building. That's just shocking to me that the museum establishments and institutions in the U.S. would ever let that happen to an artifact of that value. But the Russians, they're always pinched for pennies, and they seem to just not attach the same importance to that physical object on their side. And a lot of the cosmonauts will come back from a space station expedition, and then within a couple of years, a lot of their personal items will wind up on eBay, and that's just an income stream for them. So I don't sense that the cosmonauts have the same kind of cultural, interest in preserving one-of-a-kind objects up there. If it's expedient and if they can make use of it in the field, fine. And if it's something that they can generate a little extra income with, it seems to be, just part of the spaceflight culture over there. So I have many, many stories I could tell you about folks on the space station spending time, signing postal covers and things like that on the Russian side, because it's part of what they can do to boost their base salaries when they get back on Earth.
Hi, Tom. I'm Ann Darren. In 2001, you took a medallion up for us to the STS
98.
Yeah, for the Applied Physics Lab for Johns Hopkins University. So one thing, I'm just thrilled to have you here because you're the perfect kickoff speaker. I do want to also give a big pitch because he is Baltimore's boy done good. And we don't have a lot of them. So we're really proud of you. He just represents and all that. But I want to go back to a couple of things you said. We did lose the mirror. Totally lost the mirror. It was burned up on the way of reorbiting. Modern day historic preservation says in situ. So we end up in a situation with Hubble sitting in Leo, ISS in really low Leo, and the fact that they're potential sources of massive space debris. So I like the caregiver orbit, but also it may be the solution has to be some sort of hybrid of having some way to deorbit some of the meaningful pieces so we can preserve them. But I just wanted you to comment a little bit about that. We know we trash as we explore, and we've learned that lesson over and over again in this society. So a little comment about those two. I don't want to lose the mirror again.
Right, and again, that's an example of the Russian approach to spaceflight. When the mirror's usefulness was over for them, they just had to get it out of the way, and they didn't want it to come down on somebody's head uncontrolled, so they were able to deorbit it into the ocean. I would love to see the Destiny Science Lab that we took up on my last flight here in the museum someday. It would be a marvelous thing to be able to walk through or to examine the exterior of, because of it's been up there for over 20 years now. So those would be the vital components of the ISS. You could debate about which ones. Maybe bring one or two examples back for exhibit and education. But until we get a commercial vehicle that has something like the capabilities of the shuttle, that's not going to be practical. We need a big payload bay, and we need a robotic arm to manipulate it into the bay, and then there has to be some astronaut action to release physically the structures that hold these things in place. It's built to hang together, and so we're going to have to figure out a way to reverse engineer that. Now the Russians, for example, say they want to detach their section of the space station in the late 2020s and use it as the nucleus of their own space station up there. And we'll see if they can physically accomplish that, because it's going to be a challenge. They lack on their side some of the station-keeping attitude control mechanisms that we have on the US side of the station, the western side of the station. So there are a lot of practical problems to solve for retrieval of any parts of the ISS. It would be nice to, again, put it up there for a while so we can think about how to do that. And then when our space capabilities overtake all these practical considerations, then it'll be possible.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Please join me in a round of applause for thanking our speaker. It's wonderful. You touched on so many points that we'll continue to discuss today. If I could ask the History and Preservation panel to come to the stage, and then for AV to play the little video.
Down?
Huh?
Oh, sure.
Knock yourself out.
10, 9,
Okay, we're here.
8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, blast off. Hurry up, I want to see the moon.
Relax. It's open till 9.
That's one small step for Fry.
And one giant line for admission.
Maybe I should take Fry on the lunar rover.